Lindi sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. Mahari had just come to her, eyes wide with fear, whispering about the blood she had found. A sudden wave of fear surged through Lindi as she realized that Mahari was no longer the innocent little girl she once was. She was now the same age Lindi had been when she conceived her. Lindi realized she could no longer keep the truth from her daughter. She had known this day would come, but she wasn't ready. Not for the questions, not for the truth she had buried deep within her soul. Mahari sat across from her now, rambling about everything she had learned in life orientation class and what her teacher had taught her about what to expect during puberty. Lindi seemed dazed, not hearing a word Mahari was saying. Finally, minutes later, she spoke. Mahari, do you remember when I told you that your papa was taken from us before you were born? She began softly. Mama wasn't honest. Lindy's heart pounded against her ribs. She had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this conversation, but none seemed enough. Mahari was no longer a child. She deserved the truth. But how does one tell their daughter that the man she thought was her grandfather was in fact her father? A single tear slipped down Lindy's cheek as she reached for Mahari's hands. Angel, I need to tell you something, she whispered. Something that I hoped I would never have to tell you, but you deserve to know. The air grew heavy between them as Lindi spoke the words that had haunted her since she was 13, how her own father had stolen her innocence, how she had carried the weight of his sin in her womb, how she had chosen to lie to protect Mahari from the horror of it all. Mahari sat frozen, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. No, Mama, she choked. Not Kulu, no. Mama, no, I don't believe you. She screamed with a sharp, piercing voice that echoed across the entire house. Lindi grabbed Mahari tightly, trying to calm her down. I wanted to protect you, baby, and I needed to protect you and Gogo too. She can never know Mahari. She's too old, and this truth will break her. Silence stretched between them for almost an hour, and then Mahari finally spoke. I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry, she said, realizing what it was like for her mother to keep this painful secret and still have to face her father. We will take it to our graves for Gogo's sake. Her voice was steady now, filled with a newfound strength. For the next week, they carried on as usual, hiding their truth behind tired smiles and swallowed cries. But the universe had its own timing. One evening, as Lindi was cleaning the kitchen, the phone rang. It was her mother on the other end, telling her that her father was dying. Lindi had tried to avoid being in the same room with him for many years. The news brought no sadness, only the urgency to address unfinished business. Reluctantly, she went to the hospital and found herself sitting beside his frail body in the dimly lit hospital room. Staring at the man who had shattered her childhood, she couldn't help but boil with anger. His breath was shallow, his face wrinkled, his eyes fluttered open, and when they landed on her, he struggled to form words. He looked too weak, nothing like the man who had forced himself on her all those years ago. Lindi Wei, he croaked, his voice a whisper of regret. She leaned in closer, her voice sharp as a blade. Look at you now, weak, defenseless excuse for a man. I hope you die a cold and painful death, and you rot in the pits of hell for what you did to me and my mother. His lips parted as if to speak, but then he gasped, his throat tightening. His body quivered, his hands clawing at the air. A violent cough racked his frail frame, his eyes bulging in sheer terror. Lindi did not move. She watched as his past sins choked him, as if her words had manifested into the very force that stole his breath away. His gasps turned to wheezes. His fingers clutched the bedsheets. And then, In one last tremble, his body went still. Lindi exhaled, a weight lifting off her chest. It was finally over. He was gone. At the funeral, Lindy's mother wept as she clutched her only daughter, oblivious to the nightmare that had lived within their home for so many years. Lindi held her tightly, mourning not the man they had lost, but the truth they could never acknowledge. As the funeral program drew to a close, Mahari stood before the crowd, giving her speech as the only granddaughter. The silence that followed was heavy, waiting. She cleared her throat, her gaze locking with her mother's. "We all carry burdens," she began. "Some so heavy that they break us, but we have the power to decide what defines us. Forgiveness is not about them, it's about us. It is how we find peace when the world tries to steal it from us." No one else understood what Mahari was talking about, as her speech said nothing about her late grandfather. Lindi felt the air shift, a weight lifting. Mahari wasn't speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to her, telling her that they would be okay. The secret would stay buried, but their strength would live on. A few days after the funeral, Lindi and Mahari lingered, choosing to stay behind and keep her mother company in the quiet aftermath. The weight of grief still hung heavy in the air, but the time had come for them to leave. Mahari needed to return to school, and life had to resume, no matter how impossible it felt. Lindi went to her mother's room, intending to check if she needed anything before they left. But as she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. Her mother was sitting on the bed, surrounded by scattered photographs, her eyes fixed on one in particular, a picture of a man Lindi had never seen before. The room seemed to close in around her as her heart began to race, an unsettling chill creeping down her spine. Her mother's gaze slowly lifted, locking eyes with her in a way that sent a shiver through Lindy's body. And then, with an almost eerie calmness, her mother spoke the 8 words that would change everything. "Your real father would like to meet you." In that moment, the world tilted on its axis. The man she had loathed all her life, the one who had filled her heart with hatred for men, the one she had protected from her mother's questions and buried deep within her own soul, was not even her biological father. The man who had stolen her childhood, who had forever scarred her perception of love, was not the one who had given her life. Lindy's entire existence seemed to unravel as she realized the truth. The very man she had fought against for years, the man she had shielded her mother from, was not the source of her pain after all. And yet, that man had shaped her life in ways she could never undo,